I bought my wife by signed contract for £9,000, and the promise that she would not speak in my house until the ink was dry. That was the bargain Baron Vance set on the table the night I rode to his ruined manor for the sealed bidding, and that was the bargain I accepted, because I had already decided the rumors about his daughter were a lie a desperate man tells to sell his only asset. I am the Duke of Marrowdene, and I had come not for a bride but for a silence, a quiet woman to walk the long galleries of my hall and let me forget the chatter of the marriage market that had been hunting me for 3 seasons. The clause was the strangest part. The party of the second part, it read in the Baron's spidery hand, shall make no utterance audible to the household until the marriage register is signed and witnessed at Marrowdene Chapel. His agent, a thin solicitor with watering eyes, slid the page toward me and would not meet my look. "She is given to nerves, your grace," he said. "Speech distresses her. She has been raised quiet." I read the clause twice. I had heard the village whisper, on the long ride-in, that the Baron's eldest had not spoken since her mother died, that she was a simpleton, that she was mad. I did not believe any of it. I believed that a man who has gambled away 3 estates will say anything to be rid of a daughter at a profit. She came down the staircase 10 minutes later, and I rose. She wore a gray traveling gown that had been turned at the hem and a veil of plain net pinned high on her hair. She did not curtsy. She inclined her head a degree, met my eyes through the net for the length of one breath, and then folded her hands. They were ungloved, and one knuckle was stained faintly with ink. I noticed that. I am the sort of man who notices the wrong thing first. "Your Grace," said the Baron oilily from the door, "may I present Miss Cordelia Vance?" I bowed to her. She did not move. "Cordelia," her father snapped, "the bow." She inclined her head again the same degree, no deeper. The Baron's mouth twitched. I felt, I will not pretend otherwise, a small, pleased shock. The girl had refused to bend lower than I had. I signed the contract on the writing slope his agent held out, and I counted out the bank drafts. I did not haggle. I had already understood that I was not the one being measured in that room. We were married 3 mornings later in the small chapel at Marrowdene by my own chaplain, with 2 of my tenants for witnesses and no breakfast after. She made the responses in a whisper so faint I could not be sure she had spoken at all. The chaplain accepted it. The ring went on her finger. She did not look up at me until we were walking back down the gravel path to the house. And then she did, briefly, a clear gray look that took in the front of the hall, the long windows, the housekeeper waiting on the step. And I had the distinct, unsettling sense that she was assessing me as one would a difficult letter that required answering carefully. I had told my household that morning of the clause. I had told them she was not to be questioned about her silence, not stared at, not pitied. I had given my housekeeper, Mrs. Larkin, the keys and asked her to be kind. Mrs. Larkin had pressed her lips into the thin line she uses when she disapproves of me and is too well-bred to say so. The first week she did not speak. She ate at the long table, opposite me, in the same gray gown turned at the hem. She refused the dressmaker I sent for. She accepted, instead, a basket of plain linen and a workbox. She walked in the lower garden in the mornings. She found the library on the second afternoon. After that, she was in it whenever she was not at the table or in the garden, and she read standing, with one hand resting on the spine of whatever volume she had pulled, as though she did not feel entitled to sit in my chairs. The second week she still did not speak, but she began, very quietly, to set things right. A shelf in the library that had been arranged by a clerk who could not read Greek was, one morning, reordered. The Herodotus where the Plato had been, the Plato beside the Aristophanes, the lexicons together at the end. I noticed because I had spent years failing to be bothered enough to do it myself. A letter from my agent in Liverpool, left open on the desk where I had abandoned it in disgust, returned the next afternoon with a small slip of paper laid across the offending paragraph. A clean line in a sloping hand. "He is offering you 4% and quoting the rate at 6. Ask him for the bill of lading." No name, no flourish, just the correction. I held the slip in my hand for a long time, in the cold blue light from the library window, and I understood, slowly, The way a man understands a thing he has been refusing to see, that I had not bought a silent bride. I had bought a bound one. I did not confront her. I am a man who has lived with horses and with hounds, and I know the difference between an animal that has been broken and one that has been told, repeatedly, that it is broken. I let the slip sit on my desk 3 days, and on the 4th I answered my Liverpool agent in the exact terms she had suggested, and I sent the slip back to the library where I had found it, with 2 words written on the reverse in my own hand. Thank you. It was on the desk when I came down the next morning. Beneath my 2 words in the same sloping hand, "You are welcome, Your Grace." I stood looking at that for some time. The clause expired on the morning of the 14th day, when the marriage register was countersigned by the diocesan clerk and returned to me by the post. I carried it through the house to the morning room where she was sitting at the window with her workbox, and I laid it on the small table beside her. She looked at it. She looked at me. "The condition is discharged," I said. "You are free of it, madam. You may speak in this house." She set down her needle. She folded her hands. And for the first time she looked at me as a wife looks at a husband, not as a debt looks at the man who has paid it. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said, in a low, clear voice, the voice of a woman who has read aloud to herself in empty rooms for a great many years to keep the use of it. "I confess I am out of practice." I could not for a moment answer her. I had heard a great many voices in a great many drawing rooms in my life, and none of them had landed in the center of my chest the way that one did. I bowed to her as if she had just been presented to me, which in a sense she had. "Then practice here," I said. "There is no one in this house you must impress, madam." "Least of all me." "That is fortunate," she said, "since I have very little practice in impressing anyone." I went out of the room because I did not trust the look that was on my face, and I rode 3 miles before I could speak to my own horse with any dignity. I had meant to bring her gently into the world. I had meant to give her a season of quiet first, but I had, that morning, 3 weeks earlier, accepted an engagement that I could not now decline. The French ambassador and his suite were to be received at Marrowdene for 2 nights on their progress north, and 4 neighboring families were to dine with us on the 2nd evening. It was the great event of my county year, and I had agreed to it before the Baron's contract had ever crossed my hand. I told her at breakfast. I told her she need not appear, that I would make her excuses, that no one expected a new wife to perform in her first month. She buttered a piece of toast. She set it down. "On the contrary, Your Grace," she said, "I should be very glad to dine." The night came. I had braced myself for a small disaster, for stammering, for a downcast head, for the sneers of the county wives I have endured all my life. The ambassador, the Comte de Saint-Yves, was a man of immaculate manners and a small, knife-bright cruelty. He had a habit of testing the women at his end of the table in his own language to see them fail, and then dismissing them with a sad, indulgent smile. I had heard him do it in 3 London houses. I had counted on Cordelia's silence to remove her from his range. I had not, until that morning, considered that the silence was now lifted. She came down in a gown I had not seen, a deep wine silk that Mrs. Larkin had, I later learned, been quietly fitting to her for a week, against my orders to wait. Her hair was up. The ink stain was gone from her knuckle. She took my arm at the foot of the stairs without looking at me, and I felt her hand tremble once, very slightly, and then settle. I seated her on the ambassador's left. I had no choice. It was her place. I took the head between the Comtesse and Lady Halberton, and I prepared, with the part of my mind I keep for disasters, to step in at the first stumble. The Comte turned to her over the soup. He smiled. He said in his prettiest, slowest French, "Madame la Duchesse, on me dit que vous êtes nouvellement mariée. Permettez-moi de vous féliciter, et de plaindre un peu monsieur le duc, qui s'y trouve désormais privé de sa célèbre liberté." The table laughed politely. 2 of the county wives, who had no French, laughed loudest because they did not wish to be left out. I felt the old cold rise in my chest. Cordelia set down her spoon. She looked at the Comte with the same clear gray assessment she had turned on me 3 weeks earlier on the gravel path. "Monsieur le Comte," she said, in French so exact it made his own sound provincial, Vous êtes trop aimable de plaindre mon mari. Mais je crains que vous ne le connaissiez pas encore. Sa liberté, il la garde, il la simplement. Si moi si I, élargi pour y faire place à la mienne. A silence fell at our end of the table that was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of people who had not expected to be answered, and had been, and were now adjusting. The Comte's eyebrows rose half an inch. He recovered admirably. He smiled more carefully. He shifted to Italian his second test, and said something quick and idiomatic about the Tuscan summer and a poet I have never read. She answered in Italian, and they spoke for perhaps 30 seconds, and at the end of it he laughed genuinely and slapped his hand once on the cloth and said, "Ma chère duchesse, you correct my idiom." "Forgive me, sir," she said in English, smiling for the first time at my table. "I have not used it aloud in 9 years. I expect I have grown stiff." "You have not," he said. "I have. May I ask where you studied?" "In my father's library," she said. "He had no son. He had me translate his correspondence." "And the correspondence was in?" She thought for a moment, as though counting on a hand below the cloth. "French, Italian, German, a little Spanish. When the wine trade required it, Latin always, and a poor schoolboy Greek that I improved on my own for the pleasure of Sophocles." 6. The county counted with her. I watched Lady Halberton, who had patronized my wife at the door an hour earlier, set down her wineglass very slowly. The Comte sat back in his chair. He looked across the silver at me with a different expression than the one he had brought into the house. "Marrowdene," he said, "I had heard you had married a quiet woman." "So had I," said. "I did not take my eyes off my wife. I find I was misinformed." She did not blush. She turned the conversation, with great kindness, to the Comtesse, who had been growing anxious in the silence, and asked her in soft French about her children, and the table moved on. But the air in my dining room had changed, and every person seated at it knew it, and the woman in the wine silk on the ambassador's left went on eating her soup as though nothing in particular had occurred. Halfway through the second course, the swindler showed his hand. A neighbor of mine, I will not name him here, he is dead now, and the family suffered enough, had brought to the table a Mr. Quillen, a man of business from London with a scheme for draining a marsh on the county boundary, and the promise of a handsome return to any gentleman who cared to invest. He had been working the room before dinner. He had, I knew, already taken Lord Halberton's pledge. He turned between the fish and the joint to me, and produced from his coat a folded paper of figures and pressed it on me with the smile of a man who has rehearsed. I took the paper. I prepared wearily to be polite. Cordelia leaned a little toward me and said, in a voice pitched only for my ear, "May I, your grace?" I gave her the paper without a word. She read it slowly, holding it just above the cloth. She turned it over. She turned it back. Then she folded it once, set it down between us, and said to Mr. Quillen across the table, in the same low, clear voice she had answered the Comte in, "Sir, you have used the Dutch tonnage on your second page and the English on your fourth. You will find, if you trouble to convert, that your projected yield exceeds your stated acreage by a factor of 3. Either your marsh is larger than your map, or your sums are larger than your marsh." Mr. Quillen went the color of cold mutton. The Comte, on her other side, made a small sound that in a less elegant man would have been a laugh. "My dear lady," Mr. Quillen began. "I am not your dear lady," said my wife pleasantly. "I am the Duchess of Marrowdene, and I have been doing my husband's account books for 2 weeks because his last steward did not. I should be glad to do yours, sir, if you wish me to, but I should not advise you to wish it." Lord Halberton, halfway down the table, set his fork down very deliberately. He looked at Mr. Quillen. Mr. Quillen looked at his plate. The matter of the marsh did not arise again that night, or, so far as I am aware, in that county. When the ladies withdrew, the Comtesse took my wife's arm at the door with the warmth of a woman who has just acquired a friend and intends to keep her. The Comte at the port said to me only, "Marrowdene, if you ever tire of her, you are a fool. You will not tire of her." I said I would not. I meant it. I went up that night by the long corridor, and I stopped at her door, which stood open a hand's breadth, and I saw her sitting at the small writing desk in her dressing gown with the candle burning low and a French dictionary open and a pen in her hand. Mending, I saw at a glance, one of her own answers from the dinner. She was correcting an idiom that had not, in fact, been wrong. She had been waiting for the rest of her life to use that idiom, and now she was making sure of it for next time. I did not go in. I stood at the door and I said quietly, "Cordelia." She turned her head. It was the first time I had used her name aloud. "Your Grace, will you ride out with me tomorrow?" She set down her pen. She considered me for a moment in the candlelight with the same clear gray assessment. Then she smiled. "Yes," she said, "I should like that very much." I bowed to her in her own doorway like a boy at a first ball, and I went on down the corridor. And as I went I thought of the contract on the writing slope, and the silence I had paid for, and the woman I had thought I was bringing home, and I understood that I had not bought a quiet wife at all. I had been given, by a man who never knew what he had, a mind I would spend the rest of my life trying to deserve. She speaks now in this house every day. She rides with me at first light. She writes my correspondence in 4 languages and corrects my French at breakfast. The county that came to dinner that night talks of her still, not as the silent bride from Vance Hall, but as the duchess who answered the ambassador in his own tongue and turned a swindler from her table with 1 folded page. They tell the story in the wrong order, of course. They begin with the wine silk and the 6 languages. They never mention the slip of paper she left on my desk in her second week, or the 2 words I wrote on the back of it, or the morning I told her she was free to speak and she answered, "Thank you, Your Grace. I confess I am out of practice." But I begin there. I always begin there. Because that was the moment in the morning room at Marrowdene when a woman I had bought for £9,000 and a clause looked up from her workbox and gave me, in a low, clear voice, the first true word that has ever been spoken to me in this house. And I knew, even before she had finished the sentence, that I was the one who had been bought.